It's just so hard to say.
Uh-huh.
You
So
know,
do you do
I don't,
that? You walk around saying "Privyet"?
yeah, I'll say Privyet and Dobry Utra, which means good morning,
Mm-hmm.
Dobry Nichi, good evening, stuff like that. But I don't speak. I'm trying to learn Cyrillic, just because I'm trying to learn to find, like if you're somewhere where you need to find a bathroom, it'd be pretty nice if you knew how it was spelled. You know what I mean? Or if you
Yeah.
wanted to buy water or something like that. So, Cyrillic's not really that hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really that hard to learn. You just use association and, so it's not really that bad.
And for
But
people who don't know, those are like the Russian symbols that look different. Like the backward R is a big one. What is that?
the backward R is yeah,
Oh.
yeah. It just now I don't know exactly what any of them are called, but I just know the sounds that they make.
Uh-huh.
So it's like a yatibera, something like that. You'd use that in that circumstance.
Wow, you're sounding very like Russian.
I know. Well, this is the third time, and I think I've been on the show, your show, 3 times here, right? This is the
Uh-huh.
third time. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool, pretty cool.
So
And for the people out there, so these big conspiracies don't come up like you're working with maybe the Russians and the Americans, I don't know, to subvert our country's UFO research or something. Why don't you clear the air about why you're out there?
um, I want to use the Fifth Amendment, actually.
Oh, you do.
No, I'm just kidding. No, no, I'm here with my longtime girlfriend. Her family's from Russia, and her parents are right on the Black Sea.
Mm.
And so, and I actually bring my dog. I have a new dog this year. Unfortunately, my other one is gone, but I brought my new dog this year, and he's like trying to attack every single dog alive
Oh
on the
no.
Black Sea. It's pretty funny.
And he's
It
another
doesn't matter.
Chihuahua, right? But they have Chihuahuas
Yes,
out there, don't they?
yes, I do, and he's tried to tangle with a few of them.
Oh
Yes,
my goodness,
yeah.
that bad little boy. What's his name?
His name is a Russian name too. It's a Businka.
Oh,
Now
really?
I don't really like the name, to be honest with you, but
Mm.
But anyway, it means little bead of a necklace. So,
Businka.
but Businka, he's quite a
Hmm.
character.
That is an interesting name for a Chihuahua, that's for sure.
I know, doesn't really fit, but the
Hmm.
people here get it, so that's it.
I am Businka, Chihuahua.
Yeah,
No wonder he's trying to start fights with everybody. He feels tough.
yeah,
He's all, I'm Businka.
yeah. It's his name. It all started with the name.
Who are you,
Yeah.
little Pepe? I will crush you, Pepe. I am Businka.
Hey, you do that pretty well.
So cool. So that's why you're in Russia. And you know what? Even if you would have pled the fifth, you're not the type of personality I think that conspiracies crop up around. I have not heard a conspiracy about you being some
Hmm.
sort of alien or disinformationist. Have there been any that you're
Well,
aware of?
no, not because of Russia, but you know how it's typical when you have your own show and the remarks you get
Yeah.
and comments and things like that. So yeah, many times people have said, something about debunking or whatever, but
Mm.
I'm sure you get that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
It's typical stuff.
Yeah. Well, we'll
Yeah.
have to keep an eye on you.
Yeah, I know. Now I'll have to start doing the Russian thing.
We'll
Yeah.
have to do a FOIA on why did Martin go to Russia. See if we could get John
Sounds good.
Greenwald to research this for us.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Well, my guest, very exciting. Mark O'Connell. He
Hmm.
wrote this new book, The Close Encounters Man, about J. Allen Hynek. And Dr. J. Allen Hynek, I talk about him a lot because I'm such a fan. But he, of course,
Mm-hmm.
was the astronomer who aided the Air Force in their official UFO investigations from 1947 to, 1969, I believe. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm getting that wrong, but that's right, isn't it?
I think that's right. Yeah.
So, before he started CUFOS, his own scientific investigation into UFOs. And so, very insightful into his life. Mark and I will talk about, his background and everything, Mark's and Hynek's. And it's a great story. Hynek is a really interesting character. So, definitely run out and purchase this book, The Close Encounters Man. But we'll talk about that more with Mark O'Connell in just a few minutes here. But prior to that, we've been out for 2 weeks, so there was a little bit of a mix-up. I didn't have a show last week due to a mix-up with dates and stuff like that. I most humbly apologize. But we do have a show today, and then we might not have a show next week because this weekend is the Roswell Festival, which very excited about. There'll be a whole bunch of us researchers out there. The talk I'm doing is for the Roswell Daily Record, and I believe Chase Kletsky's going to be the MC of that event, which is sponsored and I know organized largely by KGRA, Race Hobbs of KGRA Radio. Of course, many of you, since you listen to UFO podcasts, are probably familiar with that. And we're going to have like Richard Dolan, I think Mark D'Antonio, myself, David Marler. I'm sorry, I know I'm forgetting names, but a lot of people. So you guys could look up the Roswell UFO Festival. And I've been posting on my Facebook a bunch of links also to the festival to find out more about that. So hopefully some of you will be out there. It's going to be hot in the desert. It's not an easy place to get to, although they have flights from Texas and Phoenix now that go directly into Roswell. So even though I've probably driven out there, I can't say a dozen times, but quite a dang few amount of times. And so now I'll be flying. I flew last year too, so it's very nice.
Yeah, I bet it is very convenient.
So a lot of fun. So, everybody's going to have to, if you're out there, say hello. Please come by and say hi. We're going to be at a steakhouse. I think it's called J Bob's. I laugh because it's kind of weird to have, these UFO lectures at a steakhouse. But it's attached to the Sallyport Inn, which is closed down. So the restaurant's still open, but the hotel's closed. Yeah, so very interesting situation. So that'll be cool. And then at the museum, as usual, they're doing talks and everything. And I did speak for years at the museum, but then last year the paper asked me to speak, and I wasn't sure if I was still speaking at the museum, so I went ahead with the paper, and now I'm speaking with them again. But the museum, of course, has a lot of great people. They've got Yvonne Smith, Travis Walton, Stanton Friedman, Kathleen Martin, and Don Schmidt, of course, is always there. Don Schmidt is the president of the board for the UFO Museum in Roswell. So it's going to be fun to see all those guys, too. So it's fun. It's a fun gathering to be able to see all your friends and colleagues and everything out there.
I bet.
So that'll be a lot of fun. So that's what's coming up in a few days. I will try to do an interview. I mean, there's a couple things I'd like to talk to people about. Chase Kletsky, finished her examination of the skull, the Lloyd Pye Star Child skull, in which she concluded, and she has a great report on this, that it's human, that it's not an alien. And
spoiler alert.
Yeah, well, yeah, so people can see that. And you could go to my Facebook or Chase Kletsky's and see more about that. But I want to ask her about this new kind of thing that you will talk about in the news. But and then there's Nick Pope, and I would love to talk to him about something else we'll be talking about in the news, which is these new UK UFO files. So hopefully I'll be able to grab one or both and do some interviews. If I don't do them at the event, I will have them on sometime soon anyway. And, of course, now Martin's going to try to scramble to steal these guys and get them first.
No, Nick Pope has will not be on my show. He's turned me down a number of times. He just says that he has a certain amount of shows that he appears on, one of them being yours, by golly. And he just doesn't want to take on any more shows. So
oh, really? Well, maybe I'll talk to him and see what I can do. He's a good buddy.
Well, we'll see what happens. Yeah.
But yeah, let's go ahead because I've got some news regarding him and others, but we'll get to that in the news. So let's move on to the news section with Martin Ruski Willis.
Yes, привет.
What you got for me, buddy?
Well, I really like this sighting. This was a report written up for Open Minds TV for by Roger Marsh. And military jets chased a sphere, UFO claims witness. Now, this happened in Tai, Georgia. And this guy was actually in his backyard, just stargazing back in February of this year, and he heard like low speed jet engines just north of him, and he turned to see what it was, and there was a row of flashing white strobe lights, and then there was a reddish orange ball or spear right in the middle of these jets and moving real slow. When he says moving real slow, now a military jet can't really stay airborne unless there's opposing wind below 80 knots. Otherwise it's just going to go down. It can't stay afloat. So it had to be going at least 80 knots, most likely. And so there were 6 fighter jets, and they flew overhead. He was guessing about 500 feet, which is very low. And they actually flanked. They were flanking this orange spear that appeared to be about 30 feet in diameter, and it was sort of like an orange or a reddish orange, and it was very dim with no strobe lights or anything of any kind. And after they flew over the jet on the west side of the spear, backed off and turned and got right behind the orange sphere, and then he kind of lost them to the tree line. He couldn't see them any longer, and he was saying the direction they were not flying toward a air base or anything that he knew of, and he wrote. I think he did a very nice job. I think he's actually a very good witness, and he wrote up his own graphics on the flight formation and everything with the spear in the center, and it was closed as let's see, there was Brian Traynor and Jeremy Haslam. They investigated this and closed it as unknown. And a quote from them is, "The evidence clearly leads to the conclusion that this is an unknown other sighting event." And they stated, however, the 30-foot glowing reddish orb being escorted by very recognizable jet planes begs the question, 1, did the jet planes pilots know what the orb was that they were escorting, and 2, what was their destination? So I personally think this is a really great sighting. I know there's only one witness, but I think it's a good one myself.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always tough when, with anecdotal information, but these MUFON investigators felt that this was an honest witness. And what's interesting, too, what I loved about this case, I always love the cases that have more visuals, but this witness, the paperwork, the drawings that they did with the estimations of where the craft were and details and information, and you could see these on the story at openminds.tv, but their drawings are really helpful and elaborate.
Yes.
You could tell this person put a lot of time and effort into this.
Yes.
Which just shows that they must have been really shocked and surprised by it.
Yeah. I don't think anyone's going to put this much effort into. I don't dare say the word hoax, but it doesn't read that in any type of way to me. Mm-hmm. It just really seems interesting. Now I wonder if there's any way they can try to gain any type of radar data on this at all. That's always the tough one.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the good part about these cases, and one of the cool things, one of my favorite parts of MUFON, is the Scientific Review Board, led by Robert Powell. And, we have them on every year to talk about their top 10, but they come up with a top 10, and on their cases that they feel are really significant, they'll put more effort to try to discover some more about those cases. So I could see this one, making a top 10, and hopefully then they will pursue this case to figure out if they can find out more about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
And one last thing about this, isn't that interesting? The city's name is Tai, and it's in Tift County in Georgia.
I know. It doesn't...
Those are interesting names.
I'd never heard of it before, and my family's from Georgia, and I've never
heard
of this. Yeah.
Had you heard of Tift County?
Never heard of it.
Wow.
No. We're from My family's all from about 50, 60 miles away from Atlanta in a area called LaGrange, Georgia area.
Uh-huh.
So no, never heard hell, as they say.
Yeah.
But it's right near the Florida border. I think it's about 60 or 70 miles from the Florida border.
Mm-hmm.
So it's South Georgia.
So, more news. The WOW signal. Did you read much about this?
I have seen a lot of things going on, and I guess it's a non-story, really.
Well,
is that
it depends.
What I'm understanding?
It depends on who you talk to. But it's interesting. One interesting aspect of this is the person who started all of this is Antonio Perez. Have you ever had him on your show?
No.
Yeah, so he is an astronomer, and he was a MUFON investigator. Then he left MUFON, and he created his own paranormal investigation group. So he's really been into the paranormal, and I've had him on my show, and we've actually talked about this topic and this project he was working on. So he's a really interesting guy, and he's got some great credentials. He is, the real deal, which is why this paper is such a big deal. He's an astronomer at St. Petersburg College in Florida. So what Antonio had done with a colleague is research the WOW signal because they decided to focus more on it and to figure out what it might be to see if they can figure out, is it really anomalous? Well, what they decided is that, and they wrote this up in a paper in the Journal of the Washington Academy of Sciences, and the media got a hold of this recently, so they've been writing up saying the WOW signal, it looks like it may have been figured out. It's actually a couple comets. So these comets do make a radio signals at a certain frequency, and this is the frequency of the WOW signal. And I should explain what the WOW signal is. The WOW signal was captured in August of 1977. It's a radio signal that was captured by a telescope called the Big Ear at Ohio State University. So the SETI people, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, these scientists like the movie Contact who are listening for signals, were looking at through all the paper feeds, and they saw a really powerful signal that was strange. So the scientist, his name was Jerry Eman, I think is how you say it, circled it, and he wrote "Wow!" exclamation mark on the side. So they were never able to figure out what this signal was. It was strong, and they ruled out everything they thought it might be, and they still think it's possibly strange. They don't know where it comes from. But that's why Antonio Perez is wanting to try to figure it out. What Antonio figured out is that there were a couple comets in that area at that time. Comets do make radio signals at that frequency, and those comets were not known in 1977. So he thought, okay, see, they didn't know that these comets existed back then. That's why they made the mistake, and that's the gist of his paper. However, the SETI scientists disagree.
Really?
So Jerry Eman, the scientist who originally found it, he said, no, I don't think so. And Seth Shostak, of course the most famous SETI scientist probably, besides Frank Drake, wrote up a paper as well on this saying, yeah, I don't think so either. Their argument is that comets don't make very strong signals, for one. Also, that the comets were not exactly in the right place. And then their third argument is that there were actually two horns, they call them. So there were two listening devices. One they scan different areas at different times. But the second one comes along within a minute or so of the first. So it was only the first device that recorded the WOW signal. The second device, which swept the same area soon after, did not get the signal. And their argument was that the signal had to have turned off because comets don't just turn on and off. Nothing in nature turns on and off. The signal persists or fades out or something like that. So that's why they rule out comets, and they totally disagree it's comets.
Wow.
Live Science asked Antonio Perez, well, what do you think about this? And he agreed. He was like, you know what, they're right. I'm not sure why they didn't show up on the second feed. He said his guess is, and he has some information to suggest that perhaps the telescope itself was not working correctly, and that's why it didn't get it. But of course, the onus is on him to prove that. But he says he's still working on it. So he's got a study going where they have a larger, a 10-meter radio telescope where they're going to examine comets and this signal, that the radio signal that they create, because according to him, and it sounds accurate, nobody's really studied that aspect thoroughly. So it'll still be some novel research that he'll be doing. But, you know, the debate is out there now. And even though the SETI scientists are saying, hey, guys, the WOW signal's still not explained, it could be ET, it could be something else, we just don't know. A lot of mainstream media, or some scientists even, are saying, nope, it's figured out, it's comets. So it's just kind of sparked this debate. But it's kind of cool that SETI came out and said, no, it could still be ET, you know, and
wow.
Others, you know. So this debate is raging right now. Yeah.
Wow. So I guess it's not a non-story. You know, Seth Shostak's sense of humor, I remember asking him about the WOW signal, you know, a few years ago, and he said, yeah, if only he'd written down something, I forgot what he said, but it was pretty funny. If only the guy had written down something else beside the word wow.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be we wouldn't be talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, people wouldn't be as excited about the interesting signal.
Yeah, that's right.
Instead of the wow signal. Yeah, so, and it's cool because this whole debate was sparked off by, you know, for a lack of a better term, a ufologist, someone who's interested in UFOs and stuff. So he's spoken at quite a few conferences, UFO conferences and things like that. So, yeah, people can Google him to find more, or, of course, find some more at our story. And I did link to my podcast, my last podcast with Antonio. So I like him. He's a good thinker. He's a really interesting guy. Wow. The other story. These MJ-12 documents that came out.
Yeah.
So this 47-page document alleging to be MJ-12 documents, ultra top secret, and essentially how they came out was an associate of yours, someone you worked with in the past, Heather Wade, who essentially took over Art Bell's podcast. So Art Bell, everybody was waiting. Oh my gosh, Art Bell is coming back to the radio. He's going to do a podcast. Oh, and everybody's excited. And they wait months and months and months and months. Finally, Art Bell comes on the air. It only lasted a few episodes before he retired yet again. And his producer, Heather Wade, essentially took over the show, and she's been doing it ever since. Some of you may listen. And she was given, from a source, she says, it seems like she knows who it is, and she feels the source is credible, but an anonymous source gave her these alleged MJ-12 documents that talk about the recovery of several aliens, several crashed UFOs, this sort of thing. And I think the most telling part, if you're just doing kind of a cursory review of these documents, is the alleged interview with an alien, which I find, and I think most everybody else does as well, utterly ridiculous. I mean, it seems like it's written by a teenager. Now, I feel the documents are well put together. Whoever did this, I think, is intelligent and capable and did a good job putting them together, because I think they'll probably fool a lot of people. But they should have taken that section out. You know, they probably would have been taken more seriously if they would have taken that out, because I think that it is a hoax personally. But and most people have come out saying that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I actually think it's a hoax too. And I had Kevin Randall on my show. He's kind of dissected this thing all the way through. But you're right. The part where it really falls apart, I read through the whole thing myself, And where it really falls apart is when it comes to the ET interview. And not that we'd really know what an extraterrestrial would say to any of the, but the questions, for one thing. I mean, the person who actually did this must have not watched The Arrival, that movie, because in that movie they were asking some really great questions.
Yeah.
So the questions weren't, the important questions weren't even asked. And the answers were, like Nick Pope wrote on his tweet there, like a high school student attempting badly to write science fiction. Mm-hmm. So not so good. Kevin was going to be on Heather's show, but he got bumped at the last minute. And you can kind of use your own thoughts on why that happened. I don't think, I think it's the wave is still being ridden because this thing's getting a lot of traction.
Yeah, I mean, more and more people are coming out and calling it a hoax. Even Steve Bassett, he originally, I think that's where I first heard about it, because he emailed the next morning after these came out, and he said, these could be real. I don't know. We're still looking at them. Heather Wade said, Stanton Friedman's looking at them. Although my listeners will know, Stanton and I disagree about the MJ12 files quite a bit, for reasons you can see. And I always talk with him and ask him about this stuff. But you could see that in my story at Open Mindset TV. But so I'm not sure if he's the best to analyze it anyway. But he has not said anything. I mean, he had said he's still looking into it. Even somebody in one of my forums had said he's still looking into it. So he has not come down. But Bassett has sent out another email in the last couple of days saying he's pretty sure he's out of everybody he's talked to, it looks like they're a hoax. So he's kind of come down on that side. As you've said, Nick Pope has been interviewed several times, and he also feels that way. So that's where that is.
Did you notice on the first page it says read and destroy?
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah. So obviously that didn't get done, and there was a couple of other minor flaws in that.
Silly thing about all of these documents also is the organization is referred to, and in this document as well, several different names: MJ12, Magic, Majestic 12, all of these different names, and that seems ridiculous as well. A project name is not like. It's one name. That's it. It's not important enough to keep using different types of names for a project. Whereas, on something like the MJ12, which it's all about the name MJ12, it makes more sense that hoaxers would use all of these different terms that are out there inside their hoax documents. So.
Well, also the ultra top secret, the ultra part is British. According to, pardon me, that's according to Kevin Randall. I don't know myself.
Yeah, he would know.
But someone certainly put a lot of effort into it. A lot of effort into it.
Yeah, I think so. So interesting, but it sounds like Heather Wade is still holding out hope that they're real. I'm guessing.
Yeah. Or maybe just riding a wave of publicity.
Yeah. And then another one is the UK UFO files. So, of course, we've had a lot about this before in the past, especially when we interviewed John Burroughs and when we had him at the UFO Congress, because it was due to John Burroughs that we found out about these files. So, essentially, John Burroughs, he's a witness to the Rendlesham Forest incident from 1980. He was out there in the UK at this base that was on lease by the U.S. Air Force from the Ministry of Defense when they saw these UFOs, and Burroughs saw that, and he was looking into it because he believes he had physical effects from this incident, but also he wanted to know more about it. And he found there should be some more files out there that weren't out there. Now, this was while the UK government was releasing, allegedly, all of their UFO files in batches over several years. And they told him, well, you're going to have to wait till they come out. We're putting them out in batches. Well, the last batch comes out in like 2013. I believe it was June, so this month, 4 years ago. And the files weren't in there. So he starts harassing him. Where are these files? When are you going to put out these files? And they're essentially ignoring him. But one person, because he had written some stories on this, one person in the UK did a FOIA request and said, where are these files? And they responded to this person and said, oops, sorry, I guess we didn't release all the UFO files. We'll have them out soon. And this is on their page, FOIA page. And that was 2014. They said it would probably take them a while. Going to take us like 9 months to get these files out. But 9 months comes and goes. Another year comes and goes. Other people get involved, including a lord, a gentleman in the House of Lords, Sir so-and-so. If you get knighted, you get to be a part of the House of Lords, essentially. And he asked the MOD in one of their large group meetings, where are these files? And they said, oh, we're working on it. So March, I think, was the last time they were supposed to get them out. And they kept saying they were going to get them out, and they didn't. Well, finally, they're out. However, as Nick Pope has pointed out, and I got a quote for him in our story, in the past, when they released UFO files, they would get a hold of Nick, they would give him a preview, and then when they launch, like, a lot of places do with the media, I get involved with that where they give me some information and tell me you can't release it until this period of time, so you're ready. So the media is ready and stories go out. Well, they didn't even tell Nick about it. Just very quietly, they posted on a website. They responded to some gentleman, actually, and said, hey, we've released the files. Here's a link to them. And if you go to the link, it's only a list of the files. It's not the files themselves. And even though they said there are supposed to be 18 files, there's only 15 on this list. There's a small little sentence that describes each file, but when you click on it, it says these are not digitized. You actually have to go to the National Archives in Kew, which is just outside of London, to actually go physically see these files. So, which is very strange. And Nick thinks that they're just trying to be sneaky. And so Nick Pope has taken it upon himself to make sure all the media knows about this. And sure enough, now these stories are coming out. And the Daily Mail actually did write a story today. Actually, I think it came out yesterday about some of these files because they got to go take a look at some of them, and they do have some interesting UFO cases in there, including one in October 5th, 1996, where bright lights were seen by many people for quite a long period of time. They asked Nick Pope about it, and he said, yeah, I remember that. It was a big deal, and they said it was because they did catch it on radar that they think it was just a nearby church spire. But Nick says, it was a much more interesting case than that. And it was during what Nick says is a UFO flap. So a lot of other UFOs being seen during that period of time. So, yeah, so some interesting stuff in these files. So I'm sure there'll be more to come as people look at those. But what Nick wants to do is make sure that, hopefully the media pressures the UK government and asks questions where the government kind of gives in and does what they should have done in the first place, like they did with the other files, and post digital versions of them online for free. And this is something different about the UK government. They own the files. They have copyright. Unlike here in the United States, NASA files, NASA photos, anything, anything that's released that's a government document in the United States, you can use it. There's no copyright. You as a taxpayer can do what you want with that. You can't adjust it and hoax stuff, but, you can use it. In the UK, it's different. In the UK, they maintain copyright. So you can purchase copies, but you can't share those copies with other people. So you can't just put them online like John Greenwald does. That's illegal. Of course, he only does that with U.S. files, which is no problem. But in the U.K., they can come after you for saying, hey, you're violating our copyright. So they actually charge for their files. So it was something special when they used to release UFO files that they were offering them for free for a month. If you go back now to get those files, you'll see you'll have to pay for them. And they're pretty expensive because there's so many of them. So... yeah, so hopefully we'll see some more about this, but it's kind of strange they're being so sneaky.
Yeah, that is weird, huh? Taking so long as well.
Yeah, and then finally, something I haven't written about and may or may not, I probably will eventually, is kind of Roswell Slides 2, some people are calling it, and I think it is somewhat similar, and Gaia has released this video. And, Gaia, unfortunately... is part of Gaiam. So Gaiam is this big company. If you do yoga, you know Gaiam. If you go to Target and go into the sports section, you're going to find, especially when it comes to yoga pads, stuff like that, you'll find a bunch of stuff made by this company called Gaiam. They do like yoga pants and clothing for women and that sort of thing. And they've also gotten into New Age stuff, and they have this channel where they do these New Age videos and everything. And unfortunately, the information is really bad. I mean, it's not completely. I mean, there are some UFO researchers that are on some of these shows, but a lot of what they feature are these really, dubious and uncredible information, especially when it comes to when they talk about UFOs. So they released a video where they're working with Jaime Maussan, infamous now because especially of many other, cases of known hoaxes that he has tried to push on people. But the Roswell Slides, which of course we talked a lot about, was one of those. Now they've got this skeleton from Peru that they're trying to suggest is alien or something like that. And unfortunately, there's a lot of information out there where you could read about the people involved, the supposed scientists who are people who have been behind other totally dubious and discredited investigations. So and the sad part is even if there is something mysterious about this thing that they're trying to promote as another alien body, they're not the best people to research it. They're not credible, and they are people who have either spun and misconstrued investigation or data in the past, or have been just completely outright dishonest, like in the Roswell Slide situation. Not all the investigators or researchers do I believe were dishonest in the Roswell Slide situation, but I do believe Jaime was. And Jaime was one of the bad actors in that situation. And so how can you trust him again? This is another thing that's out there. But I know, and this is one of the reasons I bring it up is because of Chase. So hopefully I'll have her on again and we'll talk about this because I know she's looked at this. She has done a lot of investigation into the skulls in Peru. She was out here in Arizona talking about that recently. So Chase Kletsky has some insights into that I think are going to be more educated than most because she's done a lot of work in Peru looking at the skulls and stuff like that. So I'm really curious to hear her take on it. So I'll see her this weekend and I'll ask her about it. If I'm lucky, we'll have some time where I'll be able to record an interview with her on it. But because she's emceeing, she's probably going to be pretty busy, so we might have to wait till after the conference to talk to her about it. But some good stuff there. So anyone can actually find this. All they have to do is put in Google Nazca lines alien. That's how unfortunately it comes up. And my very first thing that I looked at the trailer or whatever to the documentary they're making on it. And the very first thing I thought was, wow, bright white plaster. Right.
Wow, how could that? They might as well have painted it candy apple red or something. It's just like, first of all, they never used plaster, 3,000 years ago, whenever that's supposed to be, and it's pure white. and just from experience in the business that I'm in, a fine arts appraiser, when plaster sits around for even, 100 years, it yellows.
Mm-hmm.
So, the plaster that's supposed to be, I don't know, what is it, 1,700 years older? I can't remember what they said, is going to be, it's not going to be bright white. It's just impossible. Even if, the only way that would happen is if you had an absence of any elements around it, no air, in a vacuum or something. Otherwise, it's going to yellow.
Yeah, really good point. Yep, there's a number of really good points people are bringing up about all of this. John Greenwald, actually, I was messaging with him this morning. He has a write-up on this because he has someone in Peru that tells him he knows about these things, allegedly, and he says Peruvians have been faking these things, and that's where he believes it comes from. So John's not sure. He can't verify that this guy's telling, is accurate either, but he just made me aware of that claim as well, and you can see information about that on theblackvault.com. So there we go. Excellent. Lots of news in the last couple of weeks, I guess, huh?
Yeah, I guess we made up for last time.
Yep.
Yeah.
You got anything else?
No, while we were doing the show, someone tweeted on something about a, hacked NASA is saying that the alien life has been found. So I got to look into that. I don't know what that's about yet. But I don't know if that's something you have seen or heard about. It just popped up on a tweet.
Well, I've been looking at the news this morning, so I'm skeptical of that because I have not seen anything on that. The only thing I've seen is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I do have our news up so you could read this. He has said that we're, recently talking about how we're likely not alone in the universe type of stuff. But that's the closest credible news I've read about something like that. But I think I saw something in the non-credible news that mentioned something like that. So I don't waste my time with that until I'll look at it sometimes, or if I haven't heard of it. But unfortunately, it typically does not pan out or come from credible sources.
Right. Well, that's it on this side.
All righty.
Planet. Yeah.
Well, you sounded great. I mean, I think this happened last time, too, where the connection seems good and you sound great. So it's worked out really well, even though you're way out there in Russia. People are going to think we're making that up. You're not really in Russia.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I really wish I wasn't, to be honest with you. I really I love this time of year in the United States, the 4th of July and all that.
Yeah.
Going to be missing all that. But
are you going to try to celebrate the 4th of July out there?
You know what? They shoot off fireworks here all the time, so I can just pretend, maybe, I guess. Yeah.
But you can't, get the flag out and start to sing, I'm proud to be an American, because you might get in trouble.
No, I might get in trouble with that. Yeah.
All right. Well, just whisper it.
All right. All right. Well, dos vidania, my friend.
Dos vidania. Okay, let's go ahead and talk to Mark. I am very excited to welcome Mark O'Connell to the show. Hello.
Hi, Alejandro. How are you today?
Good. Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good. So, I guess just to get to know you a bit, since this is your first time on the show, your background, from what I understand, is in entertainment. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess predominantly you could say that.
Mm-hmm.
I got my start as a professional writer, writing video productions, and eventually ended up selling a few scripts to Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of got the career really rolling there.
Which is exciting. Those are two of my favorite shows. And growing up, I think Next Generation actually probably was very influential in my interest in this topic.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I guess I'm older than you, because for me it was the classic series that was a huge influence. And, as I mentioned in my book, Star Trek inspired a lot of people to go into science and a lot of people who ended up working at NASA.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting, and I like to ask this question when I interview people like who write for films or science fiction. The vision of the future often includes aliens. I mean, do you think, a lot of times when I ask the writers, they talk about how they use, the idea as a tool for whatever different things they're trying to say in their piece. But it also almost seems like there's this intuitive feeling that at one point we're going to be dealing with and interacting with extraterrestrial civilizations. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I absolutely do. In fact, I think during the course of researching and writing this book, I developed a very, very strong opinion that not only do we humans really, really want aliens to exist, I think we really need them to exist. I think it's a deep need that we all feel, whether we'll admit it or not. And I kind of think it's because if intelligent alien races exist elsewhere in the universe, I think it makes us feel less random. It makes us feel like there's more of a purpose or a point to the existence of the human race.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a certain amount of reassurance there.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. When you said that, it made me think of like the kid, the loner who's just like, I'm fine by myself. But of course that loner always, has this need that they may not even admit to themselves, which could be where a lot of people are, especially when it comes to the more mainstream scientists or those who are real skeptics, and we'll get to that topic, who really refuse to even allow themselves to entertain the possibility.
Well, in the prologue to my book, I spend a lot of time going over the history of our belief in Martians. And again, while I was researching and writing, especially that part of the book, it just stuck out so strongly to me that, wow, this is such a deeply buried part of who we are as a species that you can't deny that there's this really strong pull from outer space. There's something pulling at us. We really want something to be out there. We need something to be out there. I mean, in the late 1800s, prominent scientists all over the world believed that something was living on Mars and that it may be hostile towards us. Mm-hmm. It may even be able to fly through space and come visit us. And when I found that this was such a strong cultural theme, even as far back as the late 1800s, like I said, that's when those wheels started turning, and I just started realizing how badly we all want this to be true.
Mm-hmm. So how long have you been interested in the topic of UFOs?
Goes all the way back to my early childhood. I grew up in a small town in southern Wisconsin. My mom was a volunteer librarian at the village library, so a lot of times when she would work in the evening, she would take me along to the library because I loved books. And I would spend hours and hours in the village library, and I would always gravitate towards the one bookshelf, and it wasn't a very big bookshelf, but there was one bookshelf that had the collection of books about things like Bigfoot and poltergeists and the Bermuda Triangle and of course Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. Those were all really, really big topics, and there were always at least one or two UFO books. I'm pretty sure the first UFO book I ever read was Frank Edwards' Flying Saucers, Serious Business. And I know I read some Brad Steiger books back then. The library had some of his books. So I just, at an early age, I would just hang out in that corner of the village library and read and probably reread every book they had in that section. And so I just became really fascinated with science and outer space and space exploration and, of course, aliens. Around that time also, I started having a recurring dream. And I've talked to other people who've had very similar recurring dreams in their childhood. And in my dream, I would be back on the back steps of our house. We had a huge backyard, so a very big sky over our backyard. And in my recurring nightmare, I would be standing out on the back steps of the house looking up in the sky, and the sky would just be choked with this gigantic armada of spaceships advancing on us. Now, I don't know if they were advancing on me or on my family or on the world in general, but I just remember looking up in the sky, seeing all these spaceships coming my way, and just being absolutely terrified.
Wow. You know what's interesting? When I was a teenager, I had something somewhat similar. It was one of those dreams, that's very vivid, where you wake up and you almost feel like it actually happened. But it was me and my family, and we were in this big tube, kind of like a hamster tube or something, but we were up in the sky, like we were being transferred from one ship to another. And I was thinking, how the hell are we going to get out of this? Looking around, we got to get out of this. And that was just the scene. And it was us and the family. I remember my stepdad there, and we're walking through this tube, and I'm just thinking, how do we get out of this? And I'm terrified that we might not.
Wow.
Pretty weird.
That's intense. But, like I said, the more you tell people stories like that, the more you have people start to tell you, oh my gosh, that sounds so similar to something I experienced.
Mm-hmm.
These things are really, really common experiences.
Yeah. So you've been blogging about UFOs on your site, highstrangenessufo.com, for a while. When did you start this site?
I think I started around 2011.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of in between writing projects, and I was looking for something fun to work on, and I had a good friend who had his own very successful blog, and for months and months and probably even years, he would tell me, Mark, you got to start writing a blog. You'd be a natural at it. And I would always think, yeah, but I can't think of any topic that would be so interesting to me that I would be able to keep writing about it, on a daily or weekly or monthly or yearly basis. I just couldn't think of it. And then all of a sudden one day I thought, oh, wait a minute, UFOs. Of course, that I can write about. I can write about UFOs forever. Mm-hmm. So that's how it all got started.
Yeah.
And that's what led directly to my book about Dr. Hynek.
Mm-hmm. What sort of topics or ideas in this field inspire you most?
Well, I've really gotten to be very intrigued with the idea of belief. It's become so clear to me through writing the blog, and also, we can talk about this more later, but around the time I started writing the blog, I also became a certified UFO field investigator for MUFON. So I wasn't just blogging about UFOs, I was also investigating real UFO cases. So during that experience, I really started to learn a lot about people's systems of beliefs and how often people will share the same belief in something that seems just completely off the wall, and then they will completely part ways over another belief that is equally strange, but one person is just completely biased against it and refuses to accept its reality, which leads us to, to the concept of the term skeptic.
Right.
So I think that's been one of the things that I've found most interesting is just kind of digging into the psychology of, is there a certain type of person who sees a UFO? Is there a certain type of person who reports seeing a UFO? That has been very, very interesting to learn.
I agree. That's one of my real fascinations with this topic as well, especially in present times, when it comes to belief versus facts or things that may be provable. In that, and in fact, my last talk at our UFO Congress was around religion, just because of that, the similarities, I think, with religion in this field and how all that works. But that makes it even more interesting, and I think our next part of the conversation, even more interesting, given that you've put a lot of thought towards this, in that term skeptic, which will probably be a theme, especially dealing with Hynek, but and it probably should be, because it created a bit of reaction in you when I referred to you as a skeptic. And first, I apologize. I didn't mean it to be negative at all. And in fact, the group I posted it in, UFO Updates in particular, is a group that appreciates a skeptical point of view. I know, and that could be a hard group, actually. They can really come down on people.
Yes,
You've probably seen that. They can be pretty harsh with some of the believers, for lack of a better term, because I believe there's something to this phenomena. So in a way, I'm a believer too, but I guess a little more discerning. When I used that term, what did it invoke in you? Did you feel I was maybe being critical?
Yeah, because I have seen and heard that word skeptic being used as an insult within UFO circles. And there's always sort of this connotation that if you are going to be a UFO believer, then you must believe in every aspect of the phenomenon. You must believe every story that you hear or read. And if you don't believe in even one thing, then you're not a true believer. Therefore, you must be a skeptic. Therefore, you are, you're on the other team. You're against us. I don't know if you've experienced that before, but I have absolutely seen and heard that kind of exchange go on among UFO enthusiasts. I'll call them that. And I think it's disturbing. I think I don't think it's wise for us to paint everything in black and white, everything to be all or nothing. I think it's normal, and I think it's actually healthy to, even if you do believe, as you and I believe both do, even if we do believe that there is something real to this phenomenon, we still ought to be able to have the freedom to say, well, this story, though, I don't want to hear about, because I don't think it makes any sense, and I don't think it does us any good to talk about it because I just don't believe there's any truth to it. I think we have to be able to have filters. We have to have critical filters through which we pass all this UFO information that we're constantly seeing and hearing and reading about. And without filters, we become people who are really easily fooled, and that's not good for ufology.
I agree with you 100%, and that's why I like to tackle these terms like skeptic or debunking or believer or belief, because they do become people refer to me as a skeptic. You've like you mentioned, sometimes in a negative way, but sometimes not so much, and I appreciate it. My focus, and I guess it is sometimes a perspective thing, I always try to come from the perspective of the mainstream. So if and you've probably done this, if you're having an interview on a mainstream media organization and they refer to you, it's a UFO interview, but they refer to you as a skeptic, it's a real positive thing. Usually it means that, okay, this guy's going to be discerning, he's going to give us, and mostly what I'm arguing on those shows is that this is a legitimate phenomena. That's terribly interesting, so it works for me on that. And so I try to stay away from the perspective of the ufologist, but at the same time, in the UFO circles, I think that that's a problem, what you're talking about, the same exact problem you're talking about. So it's important for those of us who try to be more discerning to stay strong, because that can be difficult. At our conference, we get that a lot. People walk up to me and assume, I believe in this or that, chemtrails or some of these other concepts that I just do not buy into. And they're a little taken aback when I don't believe in these things because, like you said, they're like, well, I thought you were on the team,
Yeah.
But at times that kind of breaks their world. It opens some of these people up a lot. Instead of being negative towards me, a lot of times they'll then start to critically think that, well, maybe I need to think more critically about some of these topics.
Oh, well, that's encouraging.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, it's triggered two thoughts. Can I share them? Okay.
Please do.
First of all, going back to my work as a MUFON field investigator and working with UFO witnesses, I would say that the vast majority, I think I researched about 150, 160 cases during my time with MUFON. And I would say probably at least 90% of those people would not care if you called them a believer or a skeptic. It would be completely irrelevant to them, because what they've done is in most cases, they have reported they're seeing a UFO for the very simple reason that they just want to know if anyone else has seen the same thing. You know, they were in many cases watching some UFO show on cable TV, and they saw a reenactment, and it reminded them of something they had seen, and they thought, oh, I'm not the only person who's ever seen this. Maybe I should report my sighting to MUFON, and maybe they can tell me, number one, maybe they can tell me what I saw, which we're not always able to do. But the big thing is, they can just tell me if anybody else has ever seen this. And I always found that really interesting. It's kind of like, you don't really care. You're not really a believer or a non-believer. You've had an experience that was very real to you, and you just want to know what it was. So that was a real eye-opening thing. The other point I want to make, and this has to do with my book and sort of the marketing of the book. So for the past 2 weeks or so, I've been doing an awful lot of interviews like this one, and media appearances and all sorts of things. And most interviewers will just sort of fall back on the really easy distinction of, well, Dr. Hynek started out a skeptic and then he became a true believer. And, you know, as you and I both know, that, you know, that's a little too black and white. There are actually shades of gray that Dr. Hynek passed through, and to call him a true believer is going way too far, because it's, you know, brings up a lot of other issues. But in a 10-minute interview, you can't really, you know, I can't really spend the 10 minutes on a radio interview, you know, correcting the DJ about using the term true believer. But it's an issue, and it's something that has come up over and over again in my interviews, and I would really like to be able to find some way to come up with a new way to express the same idea that doesn't bring all this black and white stuff into it. And that's on me, because it's my book and they're my interviews. But it's just really interesting to see how most of these interviewers, and some of them have a lot of background in UFO research and studies, a lot of them don't. So the ones that don't, they just sort of reach for the handiest expression that sort of, you know, it gives you a quick image of what we're talking about, and you know. So for a journalist or broadcaster, it's obvious that that's why they choose the term, but there's not always the right kind of thinking behind it.
Well, you know, this phrase on your website, which I love, I think is part of the issue, because I struggle with the same thing. And your phrase is, ambiguity is more convincing than certainty, which I agree with 100%. But ambiguity comes with a lot of nuances that are difficult to explain in a soundbite. And of course, the media often, that's what they want. They want the short soundbite. So, yeah, somehow you're going to have to come up with a way to be succinct at explaining your concept there. You know who's good at that is Nick Pope. He's just a genius at kind of taking these complex ideas and putting them into a sentence or two so that they can be a quick, effective soundbite. But I understand your struggle. With your MUFON, before we move on to the book and Hynek, one of my favorite topics, being a MUFON investigator, because I did that for years too, one other aspect, which I totally agree, your perspective with the witnesses, another thing that shocked me were how many witnesses, and I wonder if you've experienced, who ask or are a little afraid that they're going to get in trouble with the government for reporting their UFO.
Oh, wow. I don't think I've ever actually run across that.
Really?
I don't think a single person has ever said that to me.
Well, that's a good thing. It's probably been about 10 years since I was really out in the field talking with people, but that would come up a lot. And hopefully, because of the media attention on this topic, that's changed and people don't feel as frightened of the government for reporting UFOs.
Well, there must be more of a realization today that the Air Force is really completely out of the picture.
Yeah, and it could have been X-Files. When I was doing this, I think it was X-Files time, so that they thought that, they were going to have to be abducted by a Mulder or the Cabal.
Yeah.
So getting to Hynek, I love talking about Hynek because I try as much as possible to mention Hynek when I write or do interviews because I don't want people to forget him because he was so important. But let's, I guess, start off with what you were talking about, kind of those shades of gray, in that Hynek was a true skeptics in that he thought this whole stuff was ridiculous to begin with in 1947 when he began this, but that changed, and maybe you can go over that with us.
Well, that's another funny thing. A lot of people who are just sort of, it seems to me it's predominantly people who are just sort of studying the UFO phenomenon, studying the history of UFOs, have it in their mind that there's this one light bulb moment where Hynek immediately changed his mind. And it's hard to push against that and explain, no, it actually took place over about 14 years of his life. It really was a long, slow, and sometimes painful process. And you can pick out the beginning and the end. The beginning was 1952, when he had already spent in 1948-49, he had spent several months working for the Air Force's first UFO study project, Project Sign. And his only job was to look through this stack of paper reports and say, oh, this one was obviously Venus, this one was obviously, a meteor, this one was obviously a comet. So his job was just to debunk UFO sightings as misidentifications of astronomical bodies and phenomena. Well, he finishes that contract, goes back to teaching college. A couple of years later, the Air Force comes back to him because the Air Force's UFO work was all done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and Hynek was teaching at the Ohio State University in Ohio Westland. So he was just kind of a natural pick. So a couple of years later, they come back to Hynek, and they say, hey, we're still having a problem with UFOs. And Hynek's like, what? You got to be kidding me. He truly believed that when the UFO sightings started in 1947, he just thought it's a fad. People are worried about another Pearl Harbor. This will all fade away over time. Well, when he discovered that it hadn't faded away, that really made a huge impression on him. And then he further discovered that when he did the first work for Project Sign, he had been able to explain away about 80% of the sightings, which left 20% unexplained, and he wasn't worried about that. He figured they could all be explained in time. Well, when he comes back into the fold 3 years later with the Air Force on Project Blue Book, he discovers that there are still 20% of the sightings year after year that remain completely unexplained. So that's what started him changing his mind. That was also a time shortly after that when he was actually sent out by the Air Force to conduct his first field investigation of a UFO sighting in Black Hawk, South Dakota, and Bismarck, North Dakota. So for the first time, Hynek's out in the field. He's talking face-to-face with UFO witnesses, many of whom he thought he was very, very impressed with, civil radar operators, Air Force personnel at Ellsworth Air Force Base. So that changed his thinking, too, because suddenly he could start seeing how it operates psychologically when a person sees a UFO and how they decide to report it. And so all of these things sort of kicked off the process. It came to its head. He finally reached the full conversion point, I guess you could say, in the wake of the 1966 Dexter Hillsdale swamp gas case, which is ironic because I believe it really was swamp gas.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's what made Hynek decide he was no longer going to, in his terms, he was no longer going to carry water for the Air Force.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's sort of infamous, which is kind of strange. He's infamous for the swamp gas quote, which, of course, people in UFO circles make fun of and think are ridiculous. And then at the same time, he's also famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, for being a advocate for UFO research later in his life, perhaps the biggest I think it could be argued he began civilian UFO investigations.
Yeah, I think you can. I think you can make that claim. He was involved with the Air Force, years before any of the civilian groups like APRO or CSI started up.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the whole idea that he had people on both sides of the UFO argument angry at him after the swamp gas incident.
Mm-hmm.
I was really intrigued by that, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I wanted to try to understand how a guy who really was just sticking with the facts and who was trying to be a good scientist, how did that somehow land him in this position where the Air Force hated him and all of his UFO buddies like Jacques Vallée were furious with him too.
Mm-hmm.
How could he have done that? So that was one of the things that really drew me into his story.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of tackle maybe each of those two, beginning with the Air Force. So he had expressed frustration that the Air Force didn't seem to be looking for real answers, but they wanted him to come up with prosaic answers or quotes for the media, like right after a sighting would happen, like in the swamp gas situation, without him being able to investigate. And he seemed to be pretty frustrated by that.
Yeah, he was constantly hamstrung by the Air Force, and he found ways to sort of work around that over time. But it did take time, and he wasn't always very successful. So that the Air Force usually won. Yeah, his dealings with the Air Force really are complicated. Part of it was that the project chief at Project Blue Book was changed over with alarming regularity. Nobody stayed in charge of Project Blue Book for very long, and they were usually low-level officers who really had no interest in the UFO topic, who were just kind of angry and resentful that they had been stuck in this situation. So yeah, that was always interesting. And Hynek, more often than not, with rare exceptions,
mm-hmm.
Hynek ended up butting heads with his commanding officer on the UFO project. One interesting twist on this whole thing, though, with the Air Force, is of course that the Air Force's initial UFO study, Project Sign, which started right at the beginning of 1948. Project Sign was actually leaning towards an extraterrestrial explanation for the UFO problem. They seriously were considering that. Their Project Sign's final report has pages and pages of speculation on life on other planets, especially Mars and Venus, and additional pages and pages seriously discussing the aerodynamic properties of cigar-shaped objects and disc-shaped objects. So the Air Force was actually seriously considering extraterrestrials in 1948 and 1949. Everyone's heard the famous estimate of the situation. Some of the officers on Project Sign put together this document promoting the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and it was basically thrown in the trash by the Air Force Chief of Staff. Mm-hmm. The extraterrestrial hypothesis died a very miserable death, and from then on it was make the UFOs go away.
So during this time too, I think part of the struggle you see from what different people who were in charge of Blue Book or some of these investigations were dealing with, and Hynek, was that really it seems the higher-ups saw the whole UFO, at least Sign, Grudge, Blue Book, as a PR kind of issue, where they were looking for this group to be their interface with the public and to calm the public down and to kind of brush us away, not really an investigation, which frustrated because especially if you're in charge of this group, you're in a lose-lose situation. You're not going to make the public happy by poo-pooing these events, especially if they're seen by credible people, and you're not going to make the Air Force happy either because you're trying to walk this difficult line. I guess my question, though, is getting to a lot of people see this. They don't understand that PR part, so they assume that it's all a cover-up, that the Air Force is trying to poo-poo all of this because they're covering up the real secrets. It doesn't seem as though Hynek felt that way, but Did he?
Well, in a sense, he did. Hynek's position is really interesting. He had spent enough time working with the Air Force on the UFO question that when it was all said and done, he just kind of felt like the Air Force really didn't know any more than they did in 1947, or not much more, and that they were really just kind of walking around with their heads in a bad place. He really did not give the Air Force much credit for, a lot of people want to think, oh, the Air Force knows everything about UFOs, they're keeping it a secret. Hynek was kind of like, nah, I don't think so. They're not that sharp. They wouldn't really be able to pull this off. He really truly felt that. I mean, he did believe that there was a more secretive UFO study, most likely going on somewhere deep in the government, and he felt that way just because he felt that's how the government handles everything. Our government is addicted to secrecy and intelligence gathering, and so he thought. So it just makes perfect sense that somebody somewhere is collecting data on UFOs, but that doesn't mean they've figured anything out. It doesn't mean they understand anything more about it than they ever did.
Mm-hmm. And he knew, and we know that a lot of the best cases were going elsewhere.
Yeah.
So which would lead him to believe that. See, and that's
Oh, I was just going to say, and there are a couple high-profile cases that most UFO enthusiasts are familiar with, where the Air Force, would publicly say, "Oh, we're not interested," and yet they were clearly very, very interested. The Washington D.C., the Washington merry-go-round. Edward Ruppelt, the project chief of Project Blue Book, was in Washington D.C. when all of these flying saucers were appearing above the U.S. Capitol's restricted airspace. Ruppelt was there, but the Air Force would not let him investigate the sightings, even though they're one of the most, detailed, well-documented, and plausible sightings in history. So there's that. There was the Kelly Hopkinsville little man invasion of 1955. The Air Force publicly said, we have absolutely no interest in that. But in reality, there were Air Force types all over the place looking into that case. So, yeah, the Air Force has never really done itself a whole lot of favors. They're not very good at maintaining a lie.
So, and before I move on, because you just touched on this, I love the Kelly Hopkinsville case because it kind of popularized the little green men term. And it was so highly, I do a talk that includes it, it was super highly influential to Steven Spielberg. It influenced E.T. and the Gremlins and his work. But what did Hynek? I know Hynek investigated, and he felt the case to be credible, correct?
Yeah, sadly, this was one of the cases that I had to leave out of the final edit of the book.
Bummer.
Yeah, I had written an entire chapter about Kelly Hopkinsville, and it was so much fun to research and write about. And then I had to delete the entire chapter. And the reason I had to delete it was because Hynek never directly investigated the case. He investigated sort of secondhand, years after the fact, so I couldn't really tie it into my Hynek narrative the way I had hoped to. But yeah, he was fascinated by that case, in part because two very credible surrogates investigated it. Bud Ledwith, who Hynek worked with a couple of years later on the satellite tracking network for the government, and Olivia, I can't remember her last name. And I don't think Olivia is her first name either. At any rate, there's a woman from, I hope the name will come to me. At any rate, she was with a civilian UFO research group, I think in Ohio, and she had independently investigated the Kelly Hopkinsville case, had interviewed almost all the witnesses, and so years later, she made contact with Hynek. Hynek put her together with Bud Ledwith. They sort of compiled their data from their investigations and came up with a pretty complete picture of what had all happened outside that farmhouse that night with the supposed invading aliens. It's a great story. It still gives me goosebumps when I read about it. I even got I had the privilege of interviewing the daughter of Lucky Sutton, who was one of the prime witnesses of the case, one of the guys who started taking shots at the aliens. And the story she told me was also hair raising. She was a really fascinating person to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the Air Force was all over that place. The very next day, a whole car full of military police from the local Air Force base showed up at the Sutton farm and poked around, and they investigated everything.
Mm-hmm.
But officially, the Air Force had absolutely no interest. It's pretty bizarre.
And a little bit of background for the listeners who don't know, this was a case in the 50s where these people claimed that, they were in the shack. This couple of families were hanging out there, and these aliens that looked like gremlins came and attacked, and these guys were out in the woods of Alabama, I believe it was, or Kentucky.
It's Kentucky. It's western Kentucky.
And so they had their guns, and they started shooting at these things, and they would bounce around and roll away and all of this stuff. They couldn't get them, and finally, when there was a break in this what they thought was an attack, they went to the police, and the police said, they were genuinely really freaked out. So just a really strange case. There's a video, I don't know if you've seen this, Mark, Monsters of the UFO, that covers this case very well. The reenactments are hilarious. They're really silly. Production-wise, they're good, but they're just really funny.
Well, you know how the Air Force tried to explain the whole thing away?
An escaped monkey, I think they said.
An escaped monkey that had been painted with silver paint for some bizarre reason. An escaped from a circus or something.
Yeah, which Hynek debunked that whole thing, from what I understand.
Yes, he did. He debunked it pretty quickly.
You'll have to put that chapter on your blog or something. That would be so great.
I plan to, because it's such a fun story.
Let me know when you do.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So now moving to the other side, and I think a lot of us, especially those of us who are seen as quote-unquote skeptic, can appreciate this, where you feel like you're attacked from all sides. But so the UFO community, in particular Vallée, so Jacques Vallée was kind of a protege of his. What frustrated Vallée about Hynek?
Well, he loved Hynek. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They had a fantastic friendship that spanned decades and decades. But over time, Vallée did get frustrated with Hynek about certain things. He thought that Hynek was a little too passive, and he thought that Hynek was a little bit too much in love with being a UFO celebrity. And I can see what he means about Hynek's seeming passivity. And Hynek admitted it himself. He said, I play the long game. I'm not an attacker. I play the long game. That's just my tendency. So, it was a very interesting relationship. Got a little strained towards the end. They both sort of went off in different directions to a certain degree with their UFO research. But yeah, an amazing friendship. Any of us would be lucky to have a friendship like the one they had.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that another thing, at least that frustrates people in the UFO field with Hynek, is that he was never willing to completely subscribe to the ET hypothesis. His argument, like Vallée and others, is that there are other possibilities.
Yeah, which is the only logical conclusion you can come to, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. Not only did he not commit to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, he wouldn't commit to any hypothesis because there wasn't enough proof to prove anything. But he was open to some really interesting ideas. He was open to parallel dimensions. He was open to the idea that maybe there's a psychic aspect to the UFO phenomenon. He was never really able to fully describe what he meant by that, but my interpretation is that he may have considered that UFOs were psychically projected into the mind of the witness. So he was willing to entertain a whole lot of really fascinating, expansive explanations for the UFO phenomenon. But yeah, the fact that he wouldn't commit to any one thing drove a lot of people nuts.
And and this is a question that came from that forum, that I put in there. You probably saw this, and a lot of people have this kind of idea, is that because Hynek would not subscribe to or commit to the ET hypothesis, and because he really didn't also commit to the idea that there's this vast, elaborate conspiracy going on and hiding of information that people felt he would be privy to, there are suspicions that he was part of the cover-up, that he's sort of this disinformation agent with relations with the FBI and CIA and so forth. Did you find any indication that that could be true at all?
No, it's not as if I spoke to anyone who said, "Oh, absolutely not, absolutely not." Mm-hmm. I mean, well, I take that back. I think Dave Jacobs pretty much just sort of chuckled when I brought up that whole conspiracy theory. I don't think Dave Jacobs put a whole lot of stock into it. But I was never able to come across any concrete evidence, one way or the other, of whether Hynek knew about and participated in this Air Force cover-up thing. I think Hynek himself would have scoffed if anybody had suggested it. But, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's a tricky question. I never got to the bottom of it. I think the one person who may have had some insight into it, aside from his late wife, Mimi, would have been his longtime friend, Jenny Zeidman, who I believe is still with us in Ohio. I tried to talk to her at the outset of researching my book. We had a very pleasant phone conversation, but it was also a very brief phone conversation. She said, "You are free to use any of my writings as resources, but I don't want to talk about it." And that was the end of our conversation. And she worked very closely with Hynek for 30 years probably. And I think if anybody knows any of Hynek's secrets, it would be her, and she's not talking. And the thing is, when somebody doesn't want to talk, you have to respect it. There's nothing you can do.
Right. So, but the other thing is that you have a better, opinion on this topic in that you've spent a lot of time, more than most, at least at this point, examining his life. And so that's why I think you would have an interesting perspective on that. I mean, especially if you didn't run across anything that made you suspect that he was part of a cover-up.
Well, there's only one story, and it's unsubstantiated, and it's a story told by Jenny Zeidman, in fact, about how after his first book, The UFO Experience, had won a local Ohio library book award. Hynek went to Ohio to accept his award and go to a luncheon, and he met up with Jenny Zeidman. This was, I believe, in 1973, somewhere about in there. But they sort of had this hush-hush conversation at their lunch table about a supposed story about the Air Force recovering a flying saucer, recovering a UFO. And the conversation didn't go very far, according to Zeidman, because the speakers started speaking to the lunch program. So they couldn't continue the conversation, and she said Hynek never spoke about it again. So it was just yet another big question mark hanging over the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. What did Hynek feel about the Roswell case?
He didn't think much of it at all. He did not care for saucer crash stories in general. And part of it was because if you're going to talk about a saucer crash story, then you have to assume that the saucer itself is a nuts and bolts physical object, and he was never willing to commit to the nuts and bolts theory. Really made him uncomfortable. He understood it. I mean, he would say, well, of course, we've taken our first steps into space, so of course we see strange things in the sky and we think they're somebody else's spacecraft. That's only logical. But he didn't put much stock in it at all. In fact, he thought that people who spread saucer crash stories were being a little irresponsible. He said, I could tell a saucer crash story and I'd get a lot of attention for it, but it wouldn't be science and it wouldn't be honest. So also the people who, the supposed saucer crash witnesses that are all out there, he just said, I've talked with many of these people and, we keep these reports on file, but, nobody's willing to speak under oath or give an affidavit because they all say, oh, no, I'm restricted by, secrecy regulations with the Air Force. So he's like, well, okay, then, you can't prove anything, so it remains just a story.
Mm-hmm. What about any connections that he did have with the FBI or CIA?
Well, I think you could say they traveled in similar circles. The only real run-in with the CIA that I went into in the book was, forgive me for a second. It's when the CIA put together their study. Oh gosh, I guess it was the Robertson panel. There's so many studies now. I'm sorry, I'm kind of losing track here.
No problem.
But in the wake of the Washington D.C. sightings in the 50s, the CIA hastily put together a UFO study group because basically they had to figure out what on earth can cause our entire air defense system over our nation's capital to be thrown into absolute chaos. That became a CIA issue. So they looked into it. They found that or at least officially, they found that there wasn't any credible threat, and so that's where it ended. And that was really, to my knowledge, and as far as what I go into in the book, that was really his only dealings with the CIA.
Mm-hmm. What makes me wonder about him in some of these cases is the whole aspect of patriotism. I mean, a lot of people in the UFO field, and you probably run across this with MUFON, a lot of them are retired military or people who are very truly patriotic. And I would count myself among those. So it's kind of a interesting to think about, what if they had asked him to keep something secret? And it's entirely possible that he ran across occasionally top secret projects. And so they're like, hey, this is what this was. Please don't say anything about it. Or otherwise. But if your government came to you, let's say you were investigating a MUFON case, and they said, we don't know what the hell that was. It kind of is scary to us, but please don't say anything. What would you do?
Oh, that is such a good question. I suppose I would not say anything, at least temporarily. Mm-hmm. I have found that when I've had questions about how to approach certain things, I'll be honest here, and I've gone to my higher ups at MUFON. Sometimes I get good advice, but sometimes I get no advice at all. So,
yeah, because I think they're like, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I think I would maybe be, out in deep trouble. I don't know. I can tell a story though that kind of has some bearing on that. If we have a few minutes.
Sure, go for it.
One of my final MUFON cases wasn't a modern-day case. It was actually a historical case. It was a gentleman who had been in the Army in 1980, and he had been stationed here in Wisconsin, and he had taken part in a mission here in Wisconsin that involved housing Cuban refugees. And at one point, the refugees tore down a huge section of fence around the camp, and so this gentleman and his infantry division had to form a human fence to keep the Cubans inside the fort until they could rebuild the metal fence, okay? So this guy and his 50 or so comrades are out night after night, day after day, forming a human fence, sleeping under the stars. And one night, this guy I'm talking to sees a very strange rectangular craft floating among the trees, not far from where they were stationed. And he said everybody up and down the human fence was looking at it, so he knows there are other witnesses. And he saw what he believed were the silhouettes of two humanoid occupants in the craft. They seemed to be watching him. And then, instead of freaking out and lying awake all night, he immediately fell asleep on his sleeping bag. So it's a very strange story. And I'm interviewing him, and we still keep in touch like a year and a half later because we both want to find out more. At one point I said, boy, if only we could contact some of the other people who were on duty that night. And he says, oh, I was the duty officer that night. I still have the roster. So cool. He sends me, I've got a duty roster from when this UFO appeared of all these 50 or so servicemen who are all standing out under the stars that night, all seeing the same thing apparently, floating through the trees. But this raises this whole question of how ethical is it to just start like calling these people up, saying, hey, I heard about this thing you saw 30 some years ago. Would you tell me about it? That's not, you can't just start doing that You can't do that to people. You can't just call them up out of the blue and sort of confront them with something that they may very well want to forget. So I went to my MUFON superiors and for some advice and really got very little help except, well, look them up on Facebook, try to contact them there. Well, that wasn't helpful to me. The guy I've been in touch with, though, the original witness, he is trying to reach out to some of his old buddies from his infantry division, though. And I figure if he reaches out to them and makes contact, that's okay, and then he can send them my way, and we can continue talking and see if maybe we can verify any of this story.
Yeah.
I hope we can someday, because it's such a fascinating case. The witness is so earnest and sincere. I can't imagine that he's exaggerating or making things up. I felt he was a very, very reliable witness. So there you go. There's a case where, and of course, his commanding officers at the base were kind of like, "You're on your own, buddy. If you want to talk about what we all saw last night, you're on your own."
How funny.
So there's your government cover-up right there.
Yeah. But like you said, it brings to mind, first of all, they don't want to talk about it. It was weird they don't want to talk about it. Second of all, maybe they feel they shouldn't because they want to be patriotic and they feel like, they probably wouldn't want me to talk about it. So there's all these things that get in the way of this information getting out there.
Yeah, excellent point. I mean, you're right. These guys were, they're middle-rank military officers. Of course, they're just going to follow the rules. They're just going to do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah. You know who's calling up these type of people all the time are the Roswell guys. So people like Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt might be some people that you could ask for advice about how to carefully approach these sort of topics with people who may not have thought about it for decades.
That's an excellent suggestion. Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much. I guess before we leave, is there one aspect or something about Hynek that you think people, maybe especially people interested in UFOs, should know that don't?
Well, I was fascinated to learn early on about his mystical leanings. When he was a student, so I can never really pinpoint it, but I'm guessing it was roughly, high school to college years. He was interested in the teachings of the Rosicrucians.
Wow.
He was very interested in the writings of a mystic named Rudolf Steiner. A lot of people know Steiner as the founder of the Waldorf education movement, but he also taught and wrote a lot about the idea of here it comes again, the parallel dimension.
Mm-hmm.
Steiner wrote about a dimension, the supersensible realm, where spiritual beings lived, perhaps even deceased human beings lived, and he felt that if we could learn to develop our innate abilities, we could cross over into that realm at will. Hynek was fascinated by that thinking when he was a student, and in his later years, when he was dealing with, a slow decline from brain cancer, he returned to those teachings and, kind of started thinking along those lines again. So that to me was a surprise, and I think it'll surprise a lot of people. Just that mystical, spiritual element to his character that really never gets talked about.
And one last thing, sorry, I just remembered something else someone had asked in that forum about his cartoons, that he drew cartoons. Is that what it is?
No, I think they're referring to two different things. He loved cartoons he loved the comic strips in newspapers, and he subscribed to the New Yorker, which is famous, I guess, for its cartoons. That was one of his favorite parts of the magazine. But there's another cartoon story, and that came about because of the swamp gas case in Michigan in 1966. In the wake of the swamp gas case, when Hynek became a national punchline and swamp gas became a national punchline, there were many, many cartoonists in magazines and newspapers drawing cartoons about flying saucers and aliens and poking fun of Hynek and poking fun of swamp gas. So, and I know for a fact, I was never able to find more than one or two in any one place in his files. The story goes that he had a huge file somewhere filled with a collection of swamp gas cartoons, that he sort of wore them as a badge of honor, even though they were poking fun of him.
Oh, that's funny. That's a person with a good sense of humor.
Yes, it absolutely is. He never took himself too seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, that's a really good thing in this kind of field.
And I've heard that he had a good sense of humor, and he was charming and a bit of a ladies' man.
Yes, I've heard that too.
Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. I haven't read it yet. It's only been out for 10 days, so really exciting. And it's great that you've gotten so much attention in these last 10 days or so, even though the book has only just come out. And this interview went so quickly, like all the great interviews that are so much fun. They go so quick. So we'll definitely have to have you back sometime.
I would love to. Anytime you ask me back, Alejandro, I would love to do it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Mark for coming on the show. What a great time I had. I mean, the time flies by. Not only do I love the topic of J. Allen Hynek because he's one of my heroes in this field, but Mark also is so knowledgeable, and he's been an investigator and a researcher in this field, so he's got a genuine interest, which is also very refreshing. So I just had a great time talking to Mark. Be sure to go get his book. I mean, I think this is a really important book. It's really important to understand and to know Hynek. The book is called The Close Encounters Man, How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs. And I do believe, Hynek is kind of the grandfather of modern UFO research because he was the first one, at least he did it officially, of course, as we talked about, but then continued it in the civilian world. And, of course, we've all kind of stood on his shoulders if we've continued to do so. You can find his book on Amazon. You can even just type in The Close Encounters Man or Allen Hynek or Mark O'Connell, Allen Hynek. You'll find it. You can also find some information about Mark on his website, which is highstrangenessufo.com. That's just highstrangenessufo.com. And you'll see there that article he was talking about UFOs and the Rolling Stone. So that's really cool. I'm excited to read that, the Rolling Stone thing. So really cool stuff. I'm so happy that Mark was able to come on the show, and we'll definitely have to talk to him some more. So really interesting stuff. So check that out. Otherwise, I also want to thank Mark Aruski-Willis for being on the show. And speaking of UFO news, like I mentioned before, it's the Roswell UFO Festival. So the Roswell UFO Festival is coming up, and it's going to be a lot of fun. That's going to be this weekend. That's where I'll be. I'll be leaving in just a couple days. I'll be there from Thursday until Monday. So I'll be a week from today. I'll be coming home. And unfortunately, even though they have direct flights from Roswell to Phoenix, because I'm going to be flying directly out there, I've got to go through Texas coming home, so it's going to be a long day of travel. Another reason it'll be difficult, if not impossible, for me to have a show posted a week from today. But with any luck, if I'm able to capture an interview out while I'm out there, then we will have a show posted Tuesday. But worst case scenario, don't worry, people, because we will have a show then the following Monday and more coming up, and we'll be talking about some of this exciting stuff that I told you we'd be talking about. But there's going to be some great people out there in Roswell. If you're going to miss them and you're bummed about it, they're doing different talks. Like for the Daily Record, actually, we're all talking about Roswell. So it'll be all kinds of stuff about Roswell. So I'll be talking about Roswell itself. But we do have some of the speakers on our Open Minds video portal. So if you go to openminds.tv, you'll see this thing about a video portal. And that's where you can watch UFO Congress lectures online, streaming video. So kind of like UFO Congress Netflix. And it's a lot cheaper than Netflix, and you can see hundreds of videos. Some of them we posted recently from the recent UFO Congress are Richard Dolan, his talk, which he wrote up especially for the UFO Congress. Yvonne Smith, who's also going to be at the UFO Museum. She's an abduction researcher, and you'll be able to look at hers. In fact, she was our Lifetime Achievement Award winner at the UFO Congress. And then David Marler, he's actually going to be speaking. Dolan and Marler are going to be speaking with me at the Chase event for the Daily News that's sponsored by KGRA. And oh, you know what I forgot to mention too is KGRA they're the people that I got news about the UK UFO files from, because the UK gentleman who got the letter saying that those were posted, he sent that letter to KGRA and they posted it on their site, and that's how I found out. So that was from Race Hobbs first, but Race Hobbs will be out there with KGRA, and so that's who Dolan and Marler and I will be speaking with at the steakhouse near the Sallyport Inn, whereas Yvonne Smith and some of the others we talked about will be at the UFO Museum a few blocks away downtown. But it'll be a lot of fun, so there'll be a lot going on. And one way or another, I'm going to be walking in the parade because a lot of my friends here from Arizona MUFON are going out, and they're going to have an Arizona MUFON float. So I'm going to be participating in that because I don't think the Roswell Daily News has a float. If they do, I'm going to have to run back and forth or something. I don't know. But it's going to be a lot of fun. So hopefully you can make it. It's really interesting. And, of course, this is the 70th anniversary, so this will probably be bigger than it has been in the last few years. It's going to be hot, so be prepared for that. Don't bring any jackets or coats. You're not going to need those. What you're going to need are those little fans that you can hang on your neck that you could squirt water in your face. That's probably going to be something better to wear than any amount of clothes. So it's going to be hot out there in the desert. Luckily, the parade now is at night, so it's a night light parade. So we've got all kinds of lights and stuff that we're going to be using out there. It's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully you can make it. If not, I'll tell you about it when I get back. And you can still watch Dolan and Yvonne and David Marler on the Open Minds video portal. So check that out. What else? I guess all of the news that we talked about you can find at openminds.tv. So go check that out. My other thank yous, the other people I want to thank Caleb Hanks for the opening and close music. Thanks again. It's beautiful, wonderful music. I love his music. It's just, I don't know what it is. I just really like it. You know how sometimes there's just music that you like, you just kind of connect with, and I really like what Caleb does. You could go to the UFO radio page at openminds.tv and read more about Caleb, and go download some of his music. If you really like that music. Sometimes I get people saying, hey, man, where do I get some of that cool music? Well, just go check out the radio page, and you'll be able to find it. It is cool music, so I don't blame you for being excited about it. So thank you to Caleb.